335 style guitar made by Sire, S-I-R-E. It's a fairly new Larry Carlton signature model. Larry's, well, he's a guitar player's guitar player. As a session guy, he was in all kinds of stuff in the 70s and 80s, in that sort of jazz fusion period. He played with Steely Dan, Quincy Jones, Michael Jackson, Fifth Dimension, even country stuff. He was on some Dolly Parton records. Just sort of a super versatile guitarist who I think later on he became really sort of a smooth jazz mainstay. In the late 80s, he got shot in the neck outside his studio, and that really messed up his voice, and there was nerve damage associated with it that paralyzed his left arm for a long time. I mean, it was a big recovery for him, but he managed to make it through. So he's still around, and he's still making music. Sire picked him up as an endorser in 2020, and they're making these to his preferences. Now, this is another American company with production overseas, in this case, Indonesia. So let's have a look at this and see what the quality control is like. On the surface, it's really beautiful. I guess, in my mind, if you're going to market a 335 style clone made overseas, it really has to be as good or better than what Epiphone's been producing for the last 15, 20 years. Because otherwise, what's the point, right? Anyway, the fit and finish is, like I said, looking pretty good. I think it's kind of amazing that given how litigious Gibson has been in the last few years trying to protect their copyrights and their designs and their intellectual property, that they don't seem to go after companies making ES335 style guitars. Because, you know, it's visually very identifiable. I guess maybe all of the individual design components were around prior to Gibson, so maybe that's why. They didn't try to do the binding nibs at the end of the frets, which is, you know, okay by me. The customer said that he felt that the nut action might have been a little high, and that he noticed that when pressing down on the first fret, some strings were going quite sharp, so we'll see. It's not too far off, though. I mean, it's better than some. I will note that the fret ends are quite sharp, which might be expected if this guitar was made in Indonesia in the summertime, and again, it's January in Canada. Things get sharp, so we'll dress those. The saddle placements for the strings seem to be pretty straight, but you never know. Depends on how much angle they've included in the design. It's possible it's right on. We'll check and see. Action at the 12th fret is pretty low. 3/64ths on the bass side, 2/64ths on the treble. So that's low and slinky. Neck relief is 0. I can't fit a feeler gauge in there. So the tops of the frets in this case are virtually straight. Maybe even a touch backbowed. I'd like to assume that it's a 4mm. Yes, it is. Okay, some things about the nut here. It is fairly wide and flat on top, and it looks like the strings make contact with the surface there for virtually the entire 6mm width, which usually I like to reduce that somewhat because there's a lot of friction, there's a lot of sort of potential for the string kind of sitting in there and then moving slightly after it's been tuned to pitch. So if we can reduce that contact point a little bit, they tend to play or stay in tune better. So I'll do a little work on that, and I'm going to reduce the nut slot height in a couple of cases here. The D string is pretty egregious. The low E is about 20 thousandths of an inch above the first fret, 0.5 millimeter, which is fine. Let's see what the high E is like. Yeah, 13, which is kind of a minimum. I don't want to take it too much farther than that because these will wear in over the next couple of years. With nut slots of the proper depth and string length set correctly, you should have fairly accurate chromatic scales, within reason,
because there are things about the equal temper fretting system that make perfect accuracy impossible. But there's also the possibility to drag the notes very sharp if you use more than moderate finger pressure. The taller the fret, the sharper it can go, and that's why when we do a refret, I tell players that it might take a little while to get your hands to adjust to the amount of pressure necessary for taller frets. On guitars with a stop tailpiece, I like to put a piece of plastic behind it during string removal so the finish doesn't get dinged. Save the offcut from unwound G strings because it's perfect for poking through the neck of a superglue bottle after it gets clogged. Traces of the maker's hand. There's a little ding in the finish under the truss rod cover from initial setup where my Indonesian compatriot banged the slotting file against the headstock. No harm done really, and it adds a certain human quality. Bit of a signature. The tops of the frets have small striations in them from what feels like 400 grit sandpaper. They work fine, but there's a kind of sandy feeling if you bend strings.
So this is what all the polishing and polishing and polishing creeps in this petty pace from day to day to the last syllable of recorded time. And all our yesterdays of lighted fools, the way to dusty death. Out, out, brief candle. This is what it's all for. There is a unique feeling that comes from playing on really polished frets. Your fingers feel faster, like they glide. Notes feel more pure simply because of the tactile feedback. It doesn't last forever, but it's definitely worth it for the time that it's there.
It's time to reshape the nut into something more Gibson-like. The profile is sort of like a quarter round. There are several pre-prepared nut lubricants. A little graphite pencil also works well. The bridge pickup in this guitar is extremely floppy, and it tends to lean towards the bridge, which is kind of disconcerting to look at. So I'll unscrew it and pull that loose. There's very little slack in the pickup leads on this one, just enough to tip it over. You want to be careful not to stretch the wires too much, obviously, because they are delicate. I'll remove the screws and loose the springs. There wasn't very much tension. Those will be replaced with an equivalent length of rubber tube, which packs more oomph than those light springs. Sometimes I need an alligator clip to hold the spring or the tube back to get the screws in position on the pickup there. In this case, the screws were long enough that I didn't need it. I'll also use some foam on the bridge side to tilt the pickup forward in line with the strings. Much more secure. It's not rocking, flopping, or making noise now.
Okay, so conclusions? Pretty nicely put together. Decent build. There's some little things here and there, like, some black dirt stuck under the finish in that area there. But for the price, it actually makes me kind of sad that they can build such a nice guitar and market it for so little. Someone's not making enough money. Here's a horse of a different color. This is an Epiphone Century Model E422T from 1959, made in the Gibson factory in Kalamazoo. It is virtually identical to a Gibson ES125T. The T stands for thin. These are thin line guitars. Yeah, they were sitting in the same racks as the Les Paul Bursts and dot neck 335s from 1959 that are now worth into the hundreds of thousands of dollars. This one is not worth that much. It's one of the modest guitars. There's no cutaway, single pickup. I mean, it's getting pretty late in the timeline for a non-cutaway electric, really. But these things lasted like this into the mid-60s at least. Single pickup, which is now missing and has been replaced with a rather anachronistic-looking miniature bucker. So we're going to put a P90 style pickup in it. I think this one is actually made by Godo. And I'll probably have to raise the pick guard up a little bit on one side with the riser to accommodate that. I mean, originally the P90 would have had a white cover. I'll leave that up to the customer to decide if he wants to go and find a white one. I mean, this will look okay. It's difficult to make the new white ones look aged enough to be appropriate in a 50s guitar. This will do. And it's a thin line, of course, so there'll be fun times fishing the wiring harness around inside. The action in this case is just about 6/64 on the bass side and about 5 on the treble, which is okay. This is owned by a slide player. So, yeah, it looks like it's had some loving care over the years. The frets are in very good shape, so I'm assuming they've been dressed, and the fingerboard itself looks very clean. The relief is about 5/1000ths, which is very nice. It's interesting. Someone has gone ahead and soldered or soldered the ground wire to the tailpiece directly to it, rather than the more typical way of doing it is just to leave bare wire and wrap it around and let the screw pressure make good contact with the metal of the tailpiece. So I have to cut that off anyway to get the wiring harness out.
And put a finger on that sharp pointy washer there to make sure it doesn't spin and make a big circle in the lacquer. That always looks awful. And down they go into the abyss. It's the same for the pickup. This is some kind of homemade arrangement to allow the screws to hold it in position. Yeah, it's a rather long piece of wood that prevents you from moving the whole assembly. You've got to take it apart before you can do that. I'll unscrew the pickup. And very carefully, after some fiddling, it comes free. Ouch. There have been a few tries. The original screw holes had been enlarged, so I had to plug them.
I'm not sure how much, or if any of this is factory. I tend to think very little, actually.
When you're dealing with an ES-style guitar, all those loose connections and excess solder and burnt insulation, sometimes it just makes more sense to start over and use known parts and put them together in a careful way so that when it comes time to fish them back in, they don't split apart on you, or worse yet, fail to function when you're done, necessitating pulling them all out again. Little tip here for people who don't realize, for vintage pushback wire, the cloth insulation cuts pretty well with standard wire strippers. Some contained, bright-looking solder. We should check the pickup output. So the multimeter's set at 20k ohms, and one probe is on the hot, the other to ground, and we see we have 7.75k ohms. I have to splice the rather short pickup lead into my harness, so I used lots of shrink tubing. And in this case, to complete the shielding, I'll wrap it with a piece of self-adhesive conductive copper foil, too. This bridges the gap between lengths of metal insulated wire. And there, a neat little package that should behave during the installation process. All that's missing is the ground wire to the tailpiece, so I'll slip that through a hole in the tail block, catch it and bring it up through the pickup route and then solder it on. I'll check and make sure that it functions first. To help with the pots, I slip a piece of old plastic drinking straw over the shafts. This being a two-pot model, it's really not too bad as compared to, say, the ES5, for instance, which has 3 pickups, 6 knobs, and a sliding switch. That's a rough one. But like anything, it takes some patience and time to do it right, child. I pull the jack up and through its hole using a wire and the barrel scavenged from an old patch cord. Then I can use a long stick to sort of probe into the straw ends and can lift that up into position to get my fingers in the game. and sort of muscle it into its hole, at which point I'll temporarily throw on a nut to hold it while I do the same for the other pot. And like virtually anything to do with guitar repair, there are different ways of handling this task. On some guitars I'll tie string around the pot shafts and use that to guide them into their holes. Sometimes I'll use long, skinny tweezers to grab them as well. On some days, the whole operation seems to go much easier than on others. With everything in place, I'll clip back the tailpiece ground, I'll strip it, and fold it over. Like I mentioned before, the pressure of the tailpiece against the wire is all that's usually necessary to make good contact. To secure the little bit of extra length I left in the leads, I'll use a cable tie. With the pickup in position, I can mark the holes for the mounting screws to re-drill those. It's important to use a drill of the right diameter because the flathead screws for the dog ear cover were missing, but I can modify the machine threads on other screws to work by tapping into the wood. I ground a little channel on the end of one, and it's just like a regular screw tap. I go in a couple of turns and then back out again to break off the chip and make threads in the wood. I can put back the original pointy washers, screw those into place, and then I'll push on the knobs, making sure the numbers line up in the same way relative to the end of the knob's travel. So when you're looking at them, 10 is in the same place on both knobs. The cutout in the guard is now a little too tight for this pickup cover, so I'll file it to fit using flat files and round files. And I'll also put on a bushing about 1/2 inch long at the front side so that things sit fairly level. These are the original Clouson tuners, and they have a couple of machines that are just so tight they're virtually immovable. If left for a long time, the grease in these can sometimes solidify, so I'll do my best to clean them out. First I'll flush them with some liquid wrench. Then I'll spray in some white lithium grease. It's messy, but it got them turning. Let's play this thing and hear how it sounds.